Welcome to the Radical Centrist Podcast, where we explore a politics that steps outside of the realm of the poisonous partisanship that has infected our country in recent years. And we seek ways to place the American voice, the American idea, above tribalism, partisan politics, and blind allegiance to ideology. To challenge ourselves to ask questions and seek answers that can bridge the divides between people, parties, and ideologies. Radical centrism is not quiet and meek, but outspoken and unapologetic. Radical centrism celebrates raucous debate, tempered with civility and humility. Fair warning. Be careful when you listen to these podcasts. You may find yourself opening your mind to the possibilities that suddenly come available to us when we listen to one another. This is your host, Wayne King, and my ultimate goal is to create aha moments where the conservative blue-collar worker or the businesswoman down the road and the liberal academic from the local college find themselves saying, that's an interesting idea. If I can just once in a while set off that light bulb, then I have the chance to convince you that there is real value in talking to one another, and more important, in listening to one another. If we listen, really listen to one another, we can find a way to express our American voice, the one that celebrates our common ideals and respects our differences. If we can find our American voice, then maybe, just maybe, we can sing together too. What a joyous sound that would be. So let's get started.
Dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try harder. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better.
Today's guest is David Concannon, attorney, explorer, partner in Concannon and Charles law firm, founder of Explorer Consulting, former general counsel to the Explorers Club International, and VP of the Explorers Club. Also a member of the Apollo 11 F1 engine recovery project with Jeff Bezos, and board member of the Holt Elwell Memorial Foundation for Camp Mowgli, the School of the Open in New Hampshire. 2023, when the disaster aboard the OceanGate Titan submersible took place, David Concannon, the sixth passenger, if you will, on the ill-fated Titan submersible, who was scheduled to be the Titanic whisperer, aka the subject matter expert, aboard the Titan when the last-minute business conflict forced him to give up his spot on the vessel in the voyage to the shipwreck. This podcast, his first extensive interview since the Titan disaster, represents an opportunity for David to look both backward and forward. He recounts the events that transpired after the Titan was launched with 5 souls and when communications were lost. He reflects on the loss of the crew and the submersible, the inept, opaque, and feckless approach of the U.S. authorities and the Coast Guard and the U.S. Navy, and the frustration and heartbreak of the outcome when it was finally revealed. And of course, he looks forward and insists that we do not take failures like this as a reason to stop exploring our universe and our planet. Here's my conversation with David Concannon. And what happened? I'm speaking with David Concannon, who is a trial attorney and a specialist on adventure. I'm not sure exactly how to put it, Dave, and that kind of leads me right into saying that I am really treading in waters that I don't particularly understand, because I think that I know that the whole area of this kind of high risk, high reward adventure and exploration is a very unique area that most people just don't have a clue about. I mean, everybody's going to have an opinion about it, and certainly did afterwards, right? But Dave, you were scheduled to be in that submersible, in the Titan, on that day, and because of an urgent business matter, you had to give up your seat and stay home to deal with a client. But so you have kind of a unique perspective on this, and I'd like to start out by just having you tell us how you got into the whole area of exploration in general, and and what brought you to a relationship with the folks at OceanGate.
Certainly, Wayne. It's I think, in fairness to anybody that's watching or listening this, we have to disclose that you and I have known each other for almost 50 years, and that you were a huge part of my early life and my early love of exploration and adventure, and were a mentor to me and a catalyst. And so, if you want to wind it all the way back to our time together at a boys' camp in New Hampshire in the 70s, that would be the genesis of it. That's the beginning. That's where the spark was lit. But when I was growing up, my heroes were not athletes, because my uncle was the quarterback of the Philadelphia Eagles. So athletes didn't mean a whole lot to me, but astronauts, wow. Jacques Cousteau, yes, absolutely. Mountaineers, fantastic. And you and I traipsed up and down a lot of mountains together, and I was generally bitching and complaining and kicking stones behind you, and you were off with your 100-pound pack and your Pooh Bear, and I reluctantly followed you up a lot of mountains. But anyway, I have had a very non-traditional career and a very non-traditional life, where I went to college. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. I was, unlike you, I was told by a moonwalker that I would never do anything significant in my life. I would never achieve what he had achieved. I would never do anything in exploration. Unlike you. You didn't tell me that. But I was kind of motivated to follow my passions as I was growing up. One of my passions was never to go to law school. I ended up in law school by accident. I hated it. I didn't like the people. So to get out of it quickly, I went to studied in Kenya at the University of Nairobi School of Law, and I studied in Europe. And I started doing mountaineering, and I was a scuba diver, and I was probably the only lawyer in my group of friends. And oftentimes, if something went wrong or somebody needed help, they would talk to the only lawyer they knew, which was Dave. And so I ended up developing a tremendous amount of expertise in exploration and in the legal issues associated with exploration, primarily because they didn't know anybody else and I didn't have any competition. So I eventually became a member of the Explorers Club in New York City, became the general counsel to the Explorers Club in New York City. I was involved with a tremendous number of expeditions and negotiations and things. And I just kept marching down this route. And about 25 years ago, I was asked to represent the people that had found the Titanic and were going to explore the Titanic further, to represent them in a case over access that initially we lost in the trial court, but we won in the appellate court and then in the U.S. Supreme Court. And then after I won the case, I was asked by my opponents that we'd beaten to come to work for them and help them organize an expedition to the Titanic. And I did that by immediately hiring all the defendants they had sued unsuccessfully in the prior lawsuit. And that started a 25-year involvement with the Titanic, with a break in the middle of where I was a member of 5 expeditions. I led one of the deep submersible expeditions to the Titanic. I was an advisor to at least a dozen other expeditions to the Titanic that I didn't go on for one reason or another. And I did a lot of other expeditions as well, and a lot of deep sea exploration. But I ended up by this year having made 4 dives to explore the wreck of the Titanic. I'd given up my seat in the sub 6 times to other people that I thought would never have a chance to see it. And that was my way of showing leadership, where I would tap somebody on the shoulder and say, you're taking my seat today. I was an advisor to OceanGate for the last 6 years, specifically on expeditions, what it takes to do an expedition to the Titanic, and the Gordian knot of legal issues associated with that. And it was my job to untie the knot and help them. They had never done anything as big as Titanic. And I may have climbed Mount Washington, but I certainly haven't climbed Mount Everest. So I'm going to get the guy who's been there so many times and has helped so many others do that. And that's the role I played starting in 2017 with OceanGate. And it was a very limited role, and it wasn't very intense work initially because they were developing their submersibles, plural, and getting all that taken care of, and I wasn't involved in that. So they didn't really need me except as an advisor and to solve some of these problems. I started in 2017 when they were going to go in 2018, but then they didn't, and they had to offset to 2019, and then they had to offset again, and then COVID hit, and then they finally went out to the wreck site in 2020. Then I went with them on the first expedition, first rotation. We called it Mission 1 on year 1, and that was the Let's Break Things expedition before the clients got there and the mission specialists, and we broke a lot of things. And I was helping them integrate the ship's crew with the sub crew and understand what the weather was like and the depth and the wreck site and all those things that they didn't have knowledge of. And then that was successful, and I went back, but I didn't dive. And I went back again in 2022 on Mission 5, and by this time they had been through 10 10-day rotations out to the site over 2 years, and they had taken the training wheels off, and they didn't really need me anymore for the operational side of things or but they did. It's nice to, when you have new people on board, to have old pros on board, and that's what I did in 2022. I was supposed to make a dive, and my dive got weathered out, and so I didn't have the opportunity to do so. Stockton Rush had felt bad about that, and he had asked me to come back in 2023, guaranteed me a dive. And my job in the sub was to be the subject matter expert on the Titanic and the wreck site, which I know very well. I couldn't say yes to that for a lot of reasons until really the very last minute, middle of April. They left in the beginning of May. But it worked with my schedule, and I was supposed to go on mission 5 and be on dive 1, which was scheduled for June 18th, 2023. And but for a client crisis that arose 36 hours before my departure, I would have been there and probably would have been in the sub. And unlike, Kim Kardashian or whoever else has got a publicist claiming it, I was actually on the dive that day. And because I couldn't go, PH Nargelet took my seat, and I've known PH for 25 years, and Stockton Rush was piloting, and know him for 6. And Hamish Harding, who's a trustee of the Explorers Club's in the sub, and I've known him for not very long, I met him in the spring, and we corresponded. And I didn't know the father and son, but I did know everyone else, and I knew about half the people on the boat. We consider OceanGate kind of a family, even if, we've all worked together for years. And so I had a lot of friends that were there. And I followed the dive in real time. I was getting updates from the ship throughout the day. And I knew when the sub was out of communications, and I was finally asked at about 6:30 on site time, Titanic time, on Sunday the 18th. I received a phone call from Wendy Rush asking me to help organize a rescue attempt through the private sector, because there is no public sector, military, governmental opportunity for a rescue. Doesn't exist. And so I was the advisor on the private sector, and Wendy said, "Can you help?" And I did. So I spent the next 5 days trying to rescue my friends, and 2 people I didn't know, but that didn't make any difference to me. I just wanted to bring them back.
And then obviously you got the bad news from did that first come through the Navy?
Never. I got the bad news within 12 hours of being asked to help through the private sector. The Navy never confirmed their implosion data, nor did the Coast Guard. But they certainly acted as if this was not a rescue, it was a recovery. At no time during my effort to help save the people on Titan did the United States Coast Guard or the United States Navy act with any sense of urgency or with any impression made to me that they were actually trying to rescue anyone. That's not what they had said publicly, and that was never what they've said publicly. But privately, they weren't. They were just throwing roadblocks up from the very beginning. And ironically, I never asked. So you have to understand, the owner of OceanGate, now that the operator, now that her husband's in the sub, is Wendy Rush. Wendy Rush calls me and says, "Can you do this?" There were 2 guys on the boat, Scott and Kyle, who were coordinating with the vessel owner, who contacted the Canadians. But we always knew that was just a phone call to say, "Hey, we have a problem, and we may be late for dinner." But and then me, and so I enlisted somebody else who was extremely effective. And we were trying to save our friends with, I never asked the Coast Guard to get involved. I never would have asked the Coast Guard to get involved, the United States Coast Guard, and nor did I ask them to pay for anything. It was always, there's always been this knowledge that the United States government has no expertise in deep ocean exploration beyond, say, 300 meters. And they don't have the assets at all. Woods Hole has the Alvin, which was built in, I think, 1960. And it may or may not have the ability to go there. It's been refitted, but the refit has taken 10 years. And I don't actually know where it is in the world at this moment. But logistically, it just was not ever a possibility. So the only people in the world that could actually go there in the 96-hour window that we had were private enterprise companies involved in deep sea mining, principally Magellan in the Channel Islands. And I knew Magellan, and I had worked with Magellan, and I knew they had the capability. They're the company that just did the sophisticated 8K mapping of the wreck that was published in May to the world. And they've got the most intense knowledge, most detailed knowledge of the wreck site. Then they have the equipment to do a search and a recovery.
Oh.
And the team of people who know the wreck site intimately. And those three pieces are pretty important because the US didn't have the ability to do a search. They never sent the capability to do a recovery within the window, and they didn't have people that were experienced. So I had Magellan ready to go, put me in coach. By noon the next day, Monday, in UK time, which would have been roughly 9 a.m. on site at the Titanic, 24 hours after the sub first went missing. And they could have been in and on site and working within the next 48 hours or less. But the United States Coast Guard overnight had taken jurisdiction, and they just said, nope, sorry, won't pick up the phone. And they wouldn't put them in. What they did instead was they sent a boat with two 3,000 meter capable ROVs to find a sub lost at 4,000 meters. And I don't know what they teach in Admiral School in the United States Coast Guard, but I know when I was in elementary school, I was taught that 3 was less than 4. And it's great that you have 2 robots that can go to 3,000 meters, but they have to go to 4,000, and the pressure's going to crush them, which it did. And it wasn't until after they were squashed that the Coast Guard said, oh, well, maybe we should get 4,000 meter ROVs. But I had a 6,000 meter ROV sitting on the tarmac in Guernsey, ready to fly out, and the US government wouldn't allow them. So that week was very, very frustrating. But before they were even on the tarmac ready to fly out, I had learned at about 3 o'clock in the morning Mountain Time, where I live, 6:30 a.m. on site at the Titanic Monday morning, that the Navy had picked up acoustic data that was consistent with an implosion. And this was hearsay. This came to me because somebody heard it. Somebody in the private sector had heard it from somebody else, who had heard it from somebody else, who had heard it from Woods Hole, who supposedly had heard it from the Navy. And it was just as likely that a dead sub without power had crashed into the bottom as it was, and there was a loud sound. What it was exactly was undetermined, but it was either an implosion or something else. And I woke up to that. I got about 90 minutes sleep the first night, and I woke up to that at 3 in the morning. So all day Monday, I was hearing it from various sources, and others were hearing it from various sources, and the Navy would not confirm it. We kept asking them, because I'm in direct communications with the boat. I'm speaking to Stockman's wife. They didn't know this information. But I wasn't going to call them up and say, really sorry, your husband's dead. I heard a rumor based on somebody said to somebody who knows somebody else that your husband's dead. So, you might as well come in. I wasn't going to do that. And the Coast Guard and the Navy never told the families until after they found out from CNN on Thursday.
Can
They
you
mentioned,
can you think of any reason why they would have not been in touch?
well, they were in touch. The U.S. Coast Guard was speaking to Kyle. They only wanted to talk to one person, and I was on all the emails, and OceanGate would send an email out. Kyle would send an email. I was copied, and then the Navy would send, or the Coast Guard would send something back, and they'd take me off, and they'd back, put me on, back, take me off, and it was like ping pong. But what the Coast Guard told Kyle was that we picked up some acoustic signatures, and it's inconclusive, and it's just we're not sure what it is, and that was communicated to the family members of which was principally Wendy Rush, the wife and daughter of the two Pakistanis were on board. PH's family was not there, and Hamish's family was not there. But that's all they told them. Just inconclusive, vague, never used the word implosion. That they heard something, but they're not sure what it is, and that they've got assets in the area that they can't really talk about because nobody's read a Tom Clancy novel from the 1980s and knows about the Sosis network. I mean, come on. So they just didn't say anything, but they certainly acted like they didn't have any sense of urgency. It was very, very frustrating for the British because they had three British citizens on board, and they wanted to get there. And it was very frustrating for the French because P.H. Nargeolet was a French naval commander, and they wanted to get there. And they didn't see any reason to slow down, and they never did. And they went despite the United States telling them not to, because we asked them to. That's part of the story that hasn't been told. And it's part of the story I know that the Navy and the Coast Guard don't want to be told. But, there's two sides. To me, there's the up to June 18th side of the story, part of the story, not side, part. And there's the after 5 o'clock in the evening on June 18th to now. And I know for a fact that the Navy and the Coast Guard don't want to talk about their feckless efforts. And I know they're not happy with me because I went on television and called them out for it. But look, the reality is, if it weren't for the tapping and the reporting of the tapping, and nobody willing to not want people not saying we're going to keep this a secret, the U.S. government never would have actually made an effort. They didn't actually make an effort until Tuesday because tapping sounds were starting to be heard overnight. And they were at regular intervals, first every 4 hours, then every 2 hours, then every 1 hour, then every half hour at 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock in a very rhythmic way. And that's what alarmed the U.S. government, because members of the Explorers Club and members of the public, we wouldn't keep that quiet. And the British didn't keep it quiet, and the Canadians didn't keep it quiet, and the French didn't keep it quiet, and the Americans were forced to act. So it took President Biden to order the mobilization of Magellan, and that was Tuesday afternoon. There's still time, but time was running out. And then within an hour, he canceled it. And then later that evening, not too much longer, Rolling Stone came out with a story publishing leaked emails from earlier in the day from the Department of Homeland Security. And that was the oh shit moment for the U.S. government, when they said, uh-oh, and they called everybody in and said, okay, everybody come to the party, but stop in Woods Hole, Massachusetts on your way, or something stupid. It was just, and I just watched this. I watched the clock wind down, and I knew that the whole time I knew about the implosion data, but that didn't, an imploded sub doesn't tap rhythmically on a regular basis. And so there's no conclusive information, and you have to act on the feeling that these people are alive, and it's a rescue operation until it isn't. And that's what we did.
So the first major sounds that they heard, they meaning the Navy or the U.S. government, or was what later they would call the implosion. Is that correct?
That's correct. And someone in the Navy did a victory lap on Thursday and said, wow, we knew the whole time. And then somebody smarter shut them down and said, stop,
Yeah,
don't say that. You know? But yeah, so all day Monday, I was getting, people were saying, and the interesting thing, Wayne, is that I kept saying, please confirm it, please confirm it, please confirm it, please confirm it, so that I can tell the boat and Wendy, so that, you know, and we'll stand down. I was told, okay, at 4:30 Eastern Standard Time, the United States Coast Guard, the admiral in charge, is going to hold a press briefing in Boston. He's going to confirm that the implosion. I said, okay, I can't watch it. It wasn't publicized, you know, but I did have somebody who was there telling me. And instead of saying that we have this data that implies an implosion, they said, this is a rescue effort, and we're doing everything possible to rescue these people within 96 hours. And we're going to search at the surface, an area the size of the state of Connecticut. And there's a 7-mile wreck site on the bottom that we have to search. And we're bringing in all assets, and we're going to get there in time. And I was sitting there saying, what? Are you stupid? Are you dishonest? Why are you lying? You're not needing to search an area the size of Connecticut on the surface, because the sub has a satellite pinger on it that pings immediately and shows its location as soon as it comes up. And oh, by the way, we have private companies tasking satellites that are looking at the surface right now. Number one. Number two, the wreck site's 5 square miles, not 7. And you don't have to search 5 square miles on the bottom. You just go to the last known position, which the Coast Guard doesn't do ever in an underwater search because they don't know how to do it. You go to last known position and you follow the current. If there's nothing beneath where we last heard them, and we last heard them almost near the bottom, and I have the coordinates, Admiral, then you go to that position and you move in the direction of the current, which incidentally runs almost always north or northeast at about a knot or a half a knot, and you'll find debris or you'll find the sub. And that area that I've been in a sub is as flat as the Kmart parking lot. And if there's something the size of Titan on the bottom, it's going to stick up, and you'll see it on your forward facing sonar. So I was screaming mad, and and let's talk about the 3,000 meter ROVs that you sent, all assets. And the other guys that have been on the tarmac now for, at that point in time, about 8 hours, and you wouldn't let them take off. And so that was maddening, but that's how this rolled. That's how the week played out. And then the ping pong would take me off the emails and all that other stuff. And I went on national television. I'm still not really clear on what shows I was on, because I was getting hundreds of media requests. And I just picked the next 2 that were closest in time to this problem that had a national audience. And I went on them back to back. And that's how the week rolled out. We were stonewalled by the US, helped tremendously by the British. Canadians were doing their part. French were phenomenal. Other countries I won't go into, but at the highest levels, at the defense minister in France, the prime minister in Britain, US senators, US congressmen, just were helping and trying to move mountains put in place by the US Navy and the US Coast Guard. it got so bad that we ended up having a US congressman on every communication and every phone call with the Navy, because they knew that they're speaking to a United States congressman, senator, and that he's part of the conversation. He's on the email. You can't take him off the emails. And that's how that went that week. And when the French got there, they were turned around and sent the other way. Pick up the phone. Congressman calls the admiral. Where are they going? Why are they leaving? Watching on computer on the AIS tracking system. They turn around, come back. Oh, they turn their AIS off. Tell them to turn it back on. Put it back on, and brought them back to the site. And it was just this a battle, an unnecessary battle, if you're trying to save people's lives. And then, you know, they found what they found. So I know some people were sighing relief because they weren't responsible for the deaths of 5 people. But, you know, that was harder for me. You know, you mentioned I was supposed to be in the sub. Yes. But you know, you take that fact and you put it in a box and you put it on a shelf and I'll deal with that later. I have 96 hours. I'm not going to cry about that now, or maybe never, but I have other things that have to get done first, and you compartmentalize it and you just push forward. So yeah, that was that week. And then I didn't ever watch the news or read the news, or I didn't care. I didn't need to see what was happening, because, you know, I was involved in it at a high level, and I was unaware, truly unaware, that the whole world was watching. That it didn't occur to me at the time, because I was too busy and I had little sleep, and I was, you know, trying so hard. But I had no concept whatsoever that the whole world was watching, and that the whole world, every single person watching, had an opinion, and mostly negative, which is fine, that they're entitled to that. But I wasn't prepared to I didn't know there was a YouTube video about me with something like 300,000 views and 67,000 negative comments or something. I don't know. Somebody told me that. I just, whatever. That's interesting, but that's irrelevant. We have until Thursday morning. But it just didn't, I didn't realize that I was sitting in this chair at this computer at this desk with my wife and our 18-year-old daughter bringing us food, surrounded by wilderness, because I live in the Rockies, high up, and I see 3 people a day, if that. I just didn't know that outside these walls was this other side of it, and that's what I've had to deal with in the time since.
What was the whole talk about the tapping that they heard? All of that came post what they had presumed was the sound of the collapse.
Right. So timeline here is that the sub went down at 9:30 in the morning, Sunday, local Titanic time, local time. It was overdue by about 5 p.m. I knew the weather was closing out. It was going to be lousy. You didn't want to do a night recovery, and they wanted to recover the sub in daylight before the weather got really bad. So they were due up around 4 or 5. And I was called at 6:30 Titanic time, saying the sub was overdue. I'm certain the Canadian vessel called the Canadian Coast Guard, because they're required by law to do so. And whatever, they were going to send some planes out overnight. And what was happening on the ship was they were waiting, the sub's overdue. They had lost contact with it. which is not unusual. Not because there's different layers of cold water in the ocean, and you can lose contact because the signal doesn't get above it, and it's happened before many times. When I did my dives, I would actually turn the radio off because it was static and white noise. They didn't have a radio on Titan; they had different mechanism. But losing communications is not a big deal. Losing tracking is, and they had lost both. So. But they thought, okay, let's give them their time. And if they're not up by this time, then, we'll start to make phone calls. Call Dave, call the Canadians. And then they were expecting the sub to come up, though. And they were also expecting that if they had lost power, which is not common, but it's not impossible. There were squibs on the landing part of the sub that would dissolve, and they would detach the hull from the heavy part, and the sub would float to the surface. And that has happened once before on Titanic, where the squibs have had to fire, and they would pop up at night and or early the next morning, and the beacon would immediately transmit to the satellite, and they'd have a fix, and they would just go and pick them up. So that was what the expectation was on the site. Wasn't until the next morning when they were starting to really they were worried, but they were really worried the next morning, and they didn't know about the implosion data. So they're hoping, because the squibs are set anywhere from 12 to 24 hours, and Stockton likes to set them for 24 hours. Scott likes to do it for 12. So they thought, okay, 9 o'clock, they're going to dissolve maybe at the earliest PM, and they'll be up at midnight. Or worst case scenario, it'll be sometime tomorrow morning, and they'll pop up by lunchtime. That was what was happening on site. Then they didn't come to the surface, and then people were scared. And so then at 2 o'clock Tuesday morning, local time, the tapping started. And the tapping was heard by multiple ships in the area that are listening. You have the ability, that's how you communicate with the sub. You listen for it to communicate. And they were picking it up. And the Canadians had dropped sonobuoys, and they were picking it up on the sonobuoys on Tuesday morning. So in the timeline of events, this isn't a lot of time that had gone by. It wasn't days and days, it was hours. So the sonobuoys started picking it up overnight Tuesday in the darkness and in the morning, and they communicated out to the British, the Americans, that we're picking up tapping, and that there's a hope that the crew's alive. I first learned about the tapping from the British Ministry of Defense. And then it was but never from the Americans. And the ship was telling me, but never the Coast Guard or the Navy. And that's when I said they kind of had their oh shit moment, because we thought it imploded. Now we hear tapping. And it was becoming more common and it was rhythmic the whole time. And it was more than just whale sounds, or at least to the people that were hearing it. They actually recorded it on the receivers that they were using, and they sent the recording to the manufacturer of the receiver and said, could you please tell us, this OceanGate did this, if you hear anything, and if you do hear anything, what do you hear? And the manufacturer came back and said, well, we were able to isolate this, and it sounds like somebody's tapping at regular intervals. So they were proofing it out. They were putting that information out. Department of Homeland Security took it seriously. The British took it seriously. The French took it seriously. And we, in the private sector, we're not going to let this go by. So I reached out to a congressman I had access to, another congressman, two that we had access to. The families were reaching out. We were marshaling our support. And eventually there was a big blockage. There was probably 3 people that were responsible in the Coast Guard, Navy, and U.S. Air Force. And at about 3 o'clock Mountain Time, Tuesday afternoon, I got a call on my cell phone from the Secretary of the Air Force, who I don't personally know, nor did I give my cell phone number to him. But he called me and said, "What's the name of the blockage? Who is it?" Gave him the name, gave him the phone number, said, "I'll take care of it." About 15 minutes later, we got a phone call from the Situation Room at the White House. Sitting with President Biden, he's going to authorize Magellan. Could we please have Magellan's phone number? Okay, stand by. I give him the phone number. 5 minutes after that, Magellan says, "We've been mobilized thanks to the president. Just spoke to 2 Navy admirals. We're on our way." My wife and I hugged, high-fived, kissed. We hugged Goldie, our teenager who was bringing us food, went to walk the dog, came back an hour later after walking the dog, getting some fresh air, first time in 2 days. And Magellan's on the phone saying we were just canceled. They just stood us down. And we were shocked. And then fortunately, the Rolling Stone story came out, and the Rolling Stone story came out a couple hours later with leaked Department of Homeland Security emails from that morning saying there's hope. And then it became a political issue where they had to do something. So by that time on Tuesday, the 3,000-meter ROVs got to the site, got squashed. The first one got imploded, and they put the second one in, and they were kind of hovering around at 3,000 meters, just trying to see if they could hear anything or see anything down another 1,000 meters in the darkness. And that was unsuccessful. So they finally mobilized an ROV that had a camera and a set of lights, but not the ability to really work, and put that on a ship back in Canada and sent it 400 miles out. That arrived Wednesday night. And that's what we did Wednesday. We were still trying to get Magellan in, still pushing. Eventually Magellan finally got to Canada, but they were getting monkeyed around with by the Coast Guard. They didn't have a boat for them. We got them a boat. This isn't easy to do. This is like, there's very, very few assets in the entire world that can actually do these things. But every owner of every private asset that we asked that was able to help did. Everyone said yes. The people that were unable to help because they were too far away, or their equipment was in dry dock, or it was disassembled in the warehouse, they did everything they could do to help. Private jet flew sonar from the West Coast to the East Coast to put on an ROV in case it could be used. And it was amazing to see the effort that the private sector put in for people they either didn't know, knew and disagreed with, or knew and just said, we'll help. Everyone said yes, everybody. And the juxtaposition between the government and the private sector was just stunning and difficult to handle. And we were all just trying to get there in time. And we were. So that made the loss of my friends and the people I knew, the family members on the boat who were grieving and scared and hearing the tapping, and they're on watch and they're hearing it and they're communicating with me, through the whole thing, still hearing the tapping, this much intervals. And I had an open line of communication with nothing blocked. And I, sitting in this chair, the hard part was I know what's happening on site. I'm not physically there, but I am mentally there, because I've been there so many times with these people who are begging for help to get there in time. And that was the hardest part of all of this. Far harder than, oh, poor Dave, I could have been in the sub, it could have been me. I never left the state of Idaho. I felt as though, because I didn't leave the state and I had this opportunity to help, I should, and I would. And, ironically, my filing, I got it in on Monday, and they kept getting kicked out by the server at the courthouse. And I finally called the clerk at Blaine County District Court in Idaho and said, I just got the president of the United States to authorize the rescue for the Titan submersible, and I can't file this with your electronic filing system. And she said, that's to keep you humble. And that was the only moment of levity I had that week. I actually laughed and cried at the same time.
Yeah, yeah. But,
So
but I'm totally confused with the sort of the timeline on all this, and how it was that you had the sounds of an implosion and then tapping later. Do you feel as if they may have survived some incident at the beginning?
no, I don't feel that they survived some incident in the beginning. What I feel, and this is rampant speculation, a hunch,
Sure.
theory, without any evidence to support it. I feel like another government with another submersible, didn't have to be as deep as the Titanic, was messing with us. I feel like potentially they were just testing our response. If you know anything about war, you know that an injured soldier takes far more resources to deal with than a dead soldier. So if you want to test your enemy's ability to react to a certain event, for example, the disabling of a nuclear submarine, why not mess with them and see how they would respond to the loss of Titan? Particularly because, hey, you probably know what the U.S. Navy knows. You probably know they're acting as though, because look, the Russians can figure out that 3 is less than 4. They know that. And in my own personal opinion, and that's based on, I was on the academic Mstislav Keldysh with the Mir submersibles that are owned by the Russian Academy of Sciences. I had chartered the ship and the subs for a Titanic expedition. When the Kursk disaster took place, when the nuclear submarine Kursk had a torpedo that went off in the tube, and Putin never left his dacha and said, well, they're all dead. I'm not going to leave my vacation, until the tapping started, until the next day with the 30 sailors that had survived the explosion were tapping. And in my opinion, why not give President Biden his Kursk moment? Why not pay him back for some of the pain you're suffering in the Ukraine, or with the embargo or something? Why not test your enemy's ability to respond to a tragedy such as a disabled submersible, a disabled nuclear sub, and see what they'll do? See who they send, see how long it takes. I would do it if it was my enemy and I was in a position of, if this opportunity had been handed to me as a military leader that was tasked with it. But that's just me speculating and wondering. I don't know what the tapping was. I know what it was. I don't know what was doing it.
Right. So, well, whether or not that's the explanation, at least there's a rational, there are probably several rational reasons why someone might think that they were still looking to be helped even after the explosion had taken place.
Well, based on what I know about the condition of the submersible when it was found, I believe it imploded when they lost contact.
Right.
And that's well informed based on my knowledge and experience with deep submersibles. I've been to this site. I've been to this place on the bottom of the ocean. That's knowing what the communications were as the sub was descending, and knowing when they last communicated, what the routines and the procedures are. I believe that the sub imploded at about a depth of 10,000 feet, about 2,000 feet before the bottom. And that's based on the dispersal of the wreckage. And remember, I led the project and the expeditions to find and recover the Apollo rocket engines from 8 Apollo missions. And I had 105 people working for me on that. So we had to study where the Saturn V, the S1Cs first stages would land, and then what would happen to them and how they would be dispersed as they fell to 14,000 feet of depth. So I'd already been through that exercise. And we found, like the engines from Apollo 11 the first hour of the first day after doing a search expedition 2 years earlier. So I kind of had a good idea of how to find things underwater at deep depth, and I feel like the experience I had with the United States Coast Guard was like, I felt as if somehow somebody had put the head of the Civil Air Patrol in Kissimmee, Florida, in charge of rescuing the astronauts on Apollo 13.
Uh-huh.
And he was calling his buddy, the retired colonel who runs the ROTC program at the local high school, to give him advice.
Yeah, I'm sorry to laugh, but yeah,
That's what it felt like.
Yeah.
And it was just,
yeah,
you know,
you want
just
to pull your hair out.
it was maddening. He stopped doing press conferences though. I made sure I had a reporter in that room with questions to ask, and he stopped doing press conferences after that.
Huh.
And it was an interesting week. I don't want to go through it again. And honestly, it was the second search and rescue I'd done in 3 days. I did one on Friday night before Titan went missing, Friday night into Saturday morning.
Which was related to what?
It was a client that had somebody had a very serious accident on one of their properties and had a traumatic brain injury and had to be rescued in the middle of the night in bad weather and flown to the United States for treatment. She survived.
Uh-huh.
But that was 11 o'clock Friday night until probably 5 in the morning, Saturday morning.
Yeah.
And the next day, while I was doing the vicious cow case.
Well, we haven't even begun to talk about the importance of exploring, and then the whole issue of certification and the materials. And I would like to do that. One of the quotations or remarks that comes to mind when I think about this whole thing is the old saying that success has a 1,000 authors, and failure is an orphan.
Perfect.
And the implosion and the announcement that they had suspended the search, all of that sort of set off a wave of I told you so's, and everybody from Cameron to Neil deGrasse Tyson was commenting on the whole thing. And but I'd like to start a little bit earlier with sort of the pre accident situation, and at least in part because you had a visit from David Pogue, who was with CBS Sunday Morning, and he went and visited and did a tour of the submersible, and during that he said, the crew fosters a culture of safety, and there are 7 redundant safety systems for returning to the surface. And he seemed to suggest that that despite the fact that there were some sort of innovative things done about to set up systems on the submersible, that there was attention paid to safety. What's your sense about all that?
Well, that was part of what I was asked to help with. And David, I was out with David and I was supposed to dive with David last year on the CBS team. I was supposed to be their subject matter expert on their dive. And David, you know, he actually, they weren't, we got weathered out, so they couldn't do a Titanic dive, but he got kind of like a consolation dive. And I didn't bother to go on that because I knew it was, a couple hours. And they couldn't get off the platform because there was an electrical issue. And electronics and saltwater don't like each other. And when you add pressure, there's even more of a problem. So David's right that there were all of these procedures put in place. There's been criticism of the Titanic, only made 13 dives out of 100 tries or something like that. Well, the reason it only made 13 dives out of 100 tries is either because on the other 983, there were weather issues or there were equipment issues, and they canceled the dive because they had a matrix of risk and they assigned points to different variables. And if you got to 50 points, they canceled the dive. And every single person on the boat had the authority and the ability to cancel a dive. Everyone, the cook could cancel a dive. And they had these meetings at 7 a.m. for an hour and 7 p.m. for an hour, ops meetings. They were mandatory. Everybody was required to attend. They would clap and embarrass you if you were late. And they went through a spreadsheet of every single issue that had to be dealt with, what the fix was, who was responsible for it, and what the timeline was. So every single person knew everything every day. I hated those meetings. I never had one of those meetings when I led an expedition. I couldn't stand them, but at least everybody knew. So there was always this attention to safety. Now there were sometimes gremlins in the system. Sometimes the thrusters would act up. They were consistently acting up. But Stockton was the kind of guy that if one pixel dot on the monitor was out, he would cancel the dive. He would focus on that. But so despite the best preparations, you can still be caught unaware. Something can still happen that you don't suspect. And we don't know what caused the sub to implode. There could be a million reasons why it did. And I would imagine that all but 4 of them were unnoticeable. And the 4 that were noticeable, somebody just didn't see. But it wasn't for lack of effort. It was interesting that all the criticism that's come out has been about the design of the sub. It's cylindrical and it's made of carbon fiber. And there was a lot of conversation and a lot of people who said this will never work, you're going to die. And they stopped talking about it 2 years ago when they first made dives. And it was crickets chirping.
Because they were successful, you mean?
Correct. And then the day the sub went missing or the day after, they all came forward with the chorus of I told you so's. And a lot of them that never said a word, really never said a word. I know Jim had some opinions about the sub, but they weren't entirely negative until after it went missing. And the Eldegrass Tyson, I know Neil and I know Jim. He never said anything to me. He never said anything. I had conversations with people in 2017, 2018 about, do you think this will work? I had a very serious conversation with PH Nargelet in 2021 and 2022. It wasn't Stockton Rush that convinced me the sub was safe. It was PH Nargelet. And PH Nargelet is one of 5 people in the world that's an expert in deep submersibles. And I had my reservations, and I still do. Even before this, I had reservations. There's things about it I didn't like. But PH was the one that said, I think it's safe. And PH made, of the 13 Titanic dives, he probably was on 11 of them, if not all of them. And so, if Werner von Braun tells you that the Saturn V rocket is safe to take you to the moon, are you going to question his qualifications? And are you going to say, well, he knows a lot more about this than I do, and he's not, and he's going, as is Neil Armstrong or, Charlie Duke or Jim Lovell. And he built it. So, you start to, you get these implicit endorsements. And one of the things that's interesting is there's 5 ways to die on the sub. Implosion is the best bad outcome, but there's also fire, freezing to death, suffocation, and drowning. So the design was set in stone before I ever came on the scene, and that wasn't going to change. I focused on the other 4 ways to die in the sub to try and mitigate against those risks. And that's where I put my effort in. And to me, an implosion, if I had to die from an implosion that day, that would have been my choice.
Right.
If you said to me, look, you have 5 choices, and which is it? Got to pick one. Can't. So I worked on the others, but I have to say, Stockton didn't always follow my advice. I hated and still hate the platform, the launch and recovery system. I call it the spruce goose. I've always called it the spruce goose, or just the goose. And everybody knows what I mean when I refer to, is the goose up? Did the goose go down? Where's the goose? They all know it. It's not a compliment. And I didn't like the goose because I felt that it added unnecessary steps to the launch and recovery procedure that took extra time, that created extra risk, that were unnecessary. And I used to say the problem with the goose is it's not a crane. And I preferred putting a sub in the water with a crane and taking it out. I never won that argument. I never stopped making it, but I never won. And Stockton, he wasn't always right, but he was always certain. And I understand. I don't like it when you call it the goose. Please don't call it the goose in front of the crew and the chefs. No, too bad. And, I don't want anybody to think that I feel that this is a good idea. But, there was a safety culture, and it didn't feel like safety theater. But the difference between this year and the last 2 years, though, there is a difference. And I just feel like, maybe there was some slippage, maybe, I don't know. It's all, you think about these, because I was having nightmares for probably the first 6-7 weeks. And these are the things that come to you in the middle of the night. But, you always kind of rationalize it. I don't know. But David was right. There were things about the sub that would give people pause, like the PlayStation controller. But then you started to think about it for a while, and you're like, no, it's elegant in its simplicity. And it is the so-called experts that have come out and said, you have to have this or else you're going to die, and you have to have that or you're going to die. I don't, that doesn't sit with me, because, here's the dirty little secret. Not everybody I would say very few people in the deep submersible, deep water exploration community have clean underwear. Everybody has had problems and has had issues. Everyone, every single one. And you learn from your mistakes, and you learn from their mistakes, and you try not to repeat mistakes. So,
well, we're not talking about grandma's drive to the grocery store here.
Exactly. It's not the slingshot ride at the state fair.
Yeah, I mean, this is high risk, high reward stuff, and I think a lot of Americans sort of treated it as during the second guessing phase, as if as if Krista McAuliffe didn't die because some little rubber part froze.
Yeah, exactly.
And not just Krista, obviously.
No, but you're right, Wayne. It is so easy to second guess. It is so easy. You know, I've been doing it for 2 months, but I wouldn't have done it. I would have done it rapidly on the morning of June 18th and made a decision. I always make a decision about whether I'm going to dive on the day of, not the night, sometimes the night before, but rarely. But I would have done the checklist in my head and the assessment in my head, and I would have talked to PH again, and I would have talked to Stockton again privately, and I would have made up my mind. And it's really amazing to me now. You know, I'll give you an example. People think it's a stupid idea to be bolted into the sub. Who else had a sub where they were bolted in? Well, Jim Cameron. And, you know, that's what was done for a long time. I was actually surprised to see the bolts. I never saw the sub until I got to the ship 2 years ago for mission 1, year 1. And then I saw that it was bolted, and I didn't like it. And I was really there are a couple things I didn't like about it, but that was one of them. So, you know, we worked on, people are bolted in. What if there's a fire? You've got this method to this mitigation, this mitigation, this mitigation. You know, it just, if you were, Stockton felt, and, you know, it's a shame because those of us that knew him, you either liked him or you didn't. There was no kind of in between. I liked him.
Mm-hmm.
I felt as though, you know, there's a saying, just because you're paranoid, it doesn't mean the world's not out to get you. The criticisms that he was facing, it was really interesting to be there in 2018, for example. If you spoke to somebody in the deep submersible or deep water community, this thing was a death trap, you were going to die. You can't make a sub out of carbon fiber. You can't make it in a cylinder. It has to be a sphere. If you spoke to somebody in the aviation industry, this was great. You were going to be, this was awesome. Why didn't anybody think of this earlier? So there was that. And then if you drilled down and you talked to the people that really knew, they would have different opinions. Many were neutral, many were not. They were negative, and a few were positive. But when you looked at the negatives, and I know all these people, you started to see, like, you ask yourself, who is biased, who has an opinion that's neutral? That's the person I want to listen to, and that was PH Nargelet for me. Who has an opinion that's biased? Is it biased in favor or biased? Why is it biased? You're a competitor. Oh, you got passed over for something. Oh, you are dishonest anyway. And there are people that are on the negative side, that one person in particular, I wouldn't trust him if he told me the sky was blue. And Stockton could sort these out. And to his credit, Stockton did seek out advice from pretty much anybody. He would listen to anybody, and he would offer, you know, one of the reasons why he didn't do certification was because the ABS and the other class society didn't have any standards for a cylindrical sub or a carbon fiber sub that would go to this depth. They just didn't have them. So there was no certification system to go through. There was no certification to test against. And what would have to happen would be that Stockton would have to give all of his intellectual property to this class societies and teach them about this design and get them to accept it and sign off on it. Now, he didn't feel the need, because he was doing the testing. He was seeking outside input. So he wasn't just living in an echo chamber. He was doing the things that the class society, he would have to pay the class society to build the testing system to test this. You know, he was doing all that. So you had two sides to this argument. And in my opinion, they were both correct. They both were right. And the higher the volume got on one side, the higher the volume got on the other side, and up and up and up. And what I saw were people that were turning their back on Stockton and not willing to help him for whatever reasons they had. And I felt as though I'm not going to do that. I know that there's 5 ways to die in the sub. We're only talking about one. And that somebody's going to get in that sub and go down. And to the extent I can help this person or I can change their mind, I'm going to try. And so that I viewed was my role. And sometimes I was successful and sometimes I wasn't. But at the end of the day, and my role was more critical in year 1 on site, which was 2021, than since. They didn't ask me for much advice over the last year, nor did they really need it. But you know, that was the situation in 2018. I never knew about the David Lockridge lawsuit, for example. I pulled all the pleadings today and read them. I wish I had known about David's. I know David. I dove with David. I wish I had known about this in 2018. Kind of like I wish I was on the boat. But what bothers me about David's case is it was over in a flash. It was over and done in 4 months. They settled it. They didn't say what they settled it for. Now they do. Now it's come out that, you know, David went to OSHA, David went to the Coast Guard, and nothing came of it. And there was a lawsuit filed, and nothing came of it. And he made allegations that actually OceanGate never answered before the case was resolved. And it was at a time when they were testing the sub. You know, David's concerns that he expressed were with the first version of Titan, which was decommissioned. It wasn't the sub that imploded. And a lot of what David raised was corrected in version 2. But version 1 still made 48 dives. It still made 3 dives to the depth of the Titanic, 3 more dives to what I consider deep water, deeper than any of the other competitors had ever been, and 6 dives to what I consider to be the deep ocean. And that hasn't been told. And when there was eventually a delamination of that hull, and the acoustic monitoring system that Stockton believed in to his death did its job. And it gave them plenty of warning, and they came up. And I'm sure they weren't happy about it at the time. I wouldn't have been. But the hull was delaminating, and they came up from the depth of the Titanic for testing in the Bahamas. Tore the whole thing apart, saw what had happened and fixed it in version 2. And then version 2 had made 13 dives to the Titanic. And the whole monitoring system actually worked. Now, did that create confirmation bias where it confirmed what I thought? I trusted it. It worked. It told me, gave me plenty of warning, and I was able to get back to the surface safely? Yes. The dome, I never knew about the dome apparently not being, the viewport not being tested below 1,200 meters. And I read today that it wasn't tested below 1,200 meters because they didn't test to depth below 1,200 meters. That's why I was only certified at 1,200 meters. I knew nothing about this until after Titan was lost. But, all right. So you test to a certain depth, you don't test beyond that. Then how can you say it can't go beyond that? Why would you say it can go beyond that? That's an equally plausible question. But Titan 1 still made at least 6 dives below the depth that was supposed to have failed without an issue. I don't know if they put a different viewport in Titan 2. I just don't know the answer to that. But looking at the wreckage, I don't think that the dome failed. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't think that the viewport failed,
Right.
you know? So it's a legitimate thing to raise and address and make sure you have answers to. At the end of the day, I would be very surprised if that was the reason why we lost the sub, or they lost the sub. I say
Now,
we, say family, because
if
they're
eliminate,
close.
they
Close.
have sufficient wreckage to check that?
I know what was recovered, and I'm not certain that they do have enough.
Yeah.
to check that.
But at the very least, I think the fact that in an earlier version, they had this this warning about delamination that caused them to return to the surface, and confirmed that the system that they had designed to indicate if there was a problem with that worked.
Worked that day.
So they weren't, it wasn't as if they were sloppy about that.
Right.
It's, you know, even if it was an issue of delamination, they at least had a rational reason for expecting that it would function okay.
Right. And in David's claims against OceanGate, he said, well, that's not enough. You need to test it to failure, and you need to scan the hull with non-destructive scanning. Well, the response to that was, there's no scanning device that it will fit into. So great idea, but there's no capability to do it. And that's what they said. I don't know if that's true, but that's what they said. And they did test it to failure. That's what they made 48 dives for. They tested it until it failed, and they were in it when the delamination occurred, and they know why it was delaminated, and they worked those bugs out in version 2. So I would assume that the expectation was that the hull, every hull has a shelf life. It has a number of dives it can do. I would assume that they believed that it would, or Stockton or people at OceanGate believed that they were not approaching that, because he, as David Pogue said, and he's absolutely correct, Stockton didn't want to die, and Stockton didn't want to kill anyone. He wasn't suicidal. He wasn't homicidal at all. He was a risk taker, but he didn't intend to kill anyone. I know that for a fact, because he did everything possible to not die and make sure that everybody understood the risks that they were facing, including that you will die. And you know, there's a lot of complaining about the liability waiver, which says the word death 3 times on the first page. I'm very fond of that liability waiver. I didn't write it, but I certainly reviewed it, and there's no ambiguity at all. And I gave the safety briefing on the first mission, and part I added to what Stockton said. And I said, listen, do you understand that you could die today? There's 2 cameras. We filmed every one of them. Don't mumble. Use your words. Say yes or no. Look into the camera and say yes or no. And there's no shame. And Stockton, we have a recording of the briefing where he said, look, if you don't want to go, we want test pilots. We don't want passengers. We don't want pilots. We want people that are willing to be test pilots, but you could die. And if you don't want to go, that's fine. That's great. We'll work it out. We'll refund it or do something else. And there's no pressure, no shame in it. If you don't want to go, you don't have to go. But if you do go, you do have to understand the risk, and you know, look into the camera and say yes or no, not just write your name on a piece of paper. And so that's an important part of this. Nobody was misled. Stockton didn't believe in class certification, and he put the reasons why on the OceanGate website in 2019. They were there for everybody to read. It was a controversy. People were were, he had passengers that paid and then pulled out because it wasn't class certified, and there was a lawsuit by a husband and wife because of it. And his defense of it was, you knew that. I told you that. It's on the website. It's not a secret. It's been talked about for years, and now you just didn't go. And so it's my view is, David, personal view, if you're going to take a risk, you should assess the risk. And if for whatever reason you decide that that's too much for you, then don't do it. And don't fool yourself, and don't fool your spouse, and don't fool your kids. My law practice focuses primarily on the trial side of it on defending scuba diving fatalities and wrongful death cases and people that die. And I have done hundreds and hundreds of scuba fatality investigations and other types of fatality investigations, and I know why people die. And there's actually a saying in my office when a new call comes in, which is basically every Monday from May to October, and someone's got to be the first to say, he was the best diver I ever saw, because that's what the husbands tell the wives. This is easy. There's no risk. Don't worry, honey. You go. I'm going to go diving with the guys today, and it's perfectly safe, and I meticulously maintain my equipment, and I'm not going to do anything dangerous. And then they die, and their family members are left saying, but he said it was safe, and he maintains his equipment meticulously, and yada yada. And then I have to be the one to sit there and say, well, the oxygen sensors in the rebreather have to be replaced every 12 months. They cost about $50, and these are 3 years old. And that means they fail, and they don't fail in a linear way. They just fail. And that means he's not going to get oxygen. Sorry. That's why we tell you to change them every year. And this is very, very, very common. So my perspective is, you tell people everything. Don't hold anything back. Don't sugarcoat it. Don't say it's a little safe. It's not safe. And you have to mitigate against your risks, and there's nobody forcing you to go. And you couldn't get on this boat and see it in St. John's Harbor with its platform that was sinking and little sub on the back and towing it 400 miles out into the ocean in poor weather, and get out to the middle of nowhere and not realize that this is dangerous, and this is something that where I may be beyond help. It's not physically possible or mentally possible to do this and not realize that it is incredibly dangerous and you may not survive. I don't believe that that's possible, having done it so many times.
Yeah. So where that leads us to, Dave, is that we live in a society that we try to limit our risks. All of us do, but we also idolize those people who step into the breach,
Yeah,
and take the risks. So here you have that instance, and I want to talk about the importance of continuing to explore and not wrapping ourselves in bubble wrap for our society. Well,
I'm right there with you. And this is the equation that I had in my head, which is I have a high tolerance for risk. I've been 16,000 feet deep in the Bermuda Triangle on a Russian submersible, and we got stuck. And I've been stuck in the Titanic. I've done these things. I ride a motorcycle. I drive my car 165 miles an hour in a charity event here in Sun Valley. I do these things, but I knew if I didn't get in the sub that day that somebody was going to take my seat. And there will always be the human, exploration is curiosity in action. And somebody will be curious enough to say, I'll take that risk. And I think somebody needs to be curious enough to say, I'll take that risk. And was it Charlie
Right.
Duke that said when he was sitting in the Apollo rocket and it was shaking and it was taking off, all he could think about was, this was built by the lowest bidder, you know, but he's still going to the moon. And, you know, I said, did this project for Jeff Bezos for the Bezos, where I recovered the Apollo rocket engines. And you'll like this. I collected every single document from the Apollo program that is left. And I hunted high and low. And there's a memo from about 1967. It's 7 pages long. And the issue that they're trying to solve is what happens if one of the F1 engines burps. 1.5 million pounds of thrust per engine, 7.5 million pounds of thrust, all going straight up. And if one burped, it would cause an oscillation. This is explained in the first 6 3/4 pages. If it burps and it causes an oscillation, and the rocket's only stable vertically and not horizontally from forces because it's being pushed, so it will cause an oscillation, and the rocket will go sideways and it'll breach, and it'll be a catastrophic failure, and everybody will die. They won't have any chance to survive. And then there's the solution. It's one sentence: don't let that happen. That is an official NASA engineering study of the problem of what happens if the engine burps. Don't let that happen.
Right.
And it's an unsolvable problem that they just, but thank you, sign off on that, put it in the file. We looked at it. Next issue, carry on. And we did it. And we did it with technology that is embarrassing, right? It's like toothpicks and soup spoons compared to what we have today. But somebody is going to take that risk. Somebody is going to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. Somebody's going to climb that mountain. Somebody, because it's there, right? That's what Mallory said.
Yeah.
And it's just human nature to peek under the rug, or to look behind the boulder, or to stand on top of it and see what you can see, and to go beyond the edge of the earth, be out there beyond this point, there be dragons. That's what the old maps used to say.
Right.
And see what you can find. And then I was always asked, what's left to explore, when I was VP of the Explorers Club? And the answer is everything. Because the last time we were in some of these places, we had such poor technology that we couldn't document it. And I was asked to give Jeff an award. Buzz Aldrin was supposed to do it. He didn't show, and I had to do it. And I had about 3 hours to prepare, and I thought, what am I going to say? So I came up with this analogy, and I said, an adventurer is somebody that goes from here to there and comes back and says, this is what I did. An explorer is somebody who goes from here to there and comes back and says, this is what I learned. And that's truly, in my opinion, the definition of an explorer. And people are curious and they want to learn, so they're going to do these things, despite the risks. And it's my job as a lawyer, or as a consultant, or as a human being with a brain and a heart, to try to mitigate the risks so people don't get hurt. But I ride motorcycles. I've ridden all through the state of New Hampshire. I shake my head whenever I see a motorcyclist without a helmet. That's not a risk I'm willing to take. I've watched a guy die falling off in a motorcycle accident when he didn't have a helmet on, and otherwise it was survivable. And that's just not something I would do. But hundreds of thousands of motorcyclists ride every day without helmets.
Right.
And I don't think it's the government's job to tell us how to protect ourselves and mandate bubble wrap. And I don't know. Wayne, I wish I knew the answer. All I know is that somebody else would have gotten in that seat that day because of curiosity. And
that's ultimately what keeps pushing us forward on the horizon, isn't it?
In my view, it is. And I say that having done it, and I say that having helped other people do it. And I don't believe that we should not learn from our mistakes and try not to repeat our mistakes. I don't believe that we should take risks that are that you that are stupid, really, like riding a motorcycle without a helmet. I'll go out on a limb here and say I think that's stupid.
Mhm.
But I know people don't agree with me, and that's not a popular thing to say with some people, but in my view, that's the risk of an injury is too high, and the certainty of an accident is also too high. So those two lines are going to intersect for every motorcyclist. You've either been down or you're going to go down.
Yeah.
And you need to be careful enough to make sure that you can survive it if you want to. PH was perfectly happy. I know this because he told me, and he told others. He was perfectly happy to die in the subdiving in the Titanic. He felt that was an acceptable, preferable way to go. And his exact words were, "I don't want to die in a hospital bed." And that was how he felt. So I don't feel bad for PH, really. I'm sorry that he died, but I know how he felt about dying in that way, in that place. And it was on his list of things that he would prefer.
And I would venture to say that, of all the folks that from the Explorers Club, that most of them would say the same thing.
Yeah. And most of them have said the same thing. And I've been to a lot of funerals of people who have told me that. And unfortunately, it's not something we like to talk about. I don't like to talk about, but I have lost a lot of friends involved doing exploration, and I can analytically tell you what the trigger was and what the first link in the causal chain was and what every other link was thereafter. And that doesn't bring them back. But here's the thing. I hate the expression "he died doing what he loved" so much. I hear it all the time in my work, and I hate it so much. And it's just a lie. But I will say that a lot of people I know have died willing to take the risks that they would die, and they have. And it's cold comfort to their wives and children, and it's always the guys. Unfortunately, we're not that bright. It's just they just do, and I wish they wouldn't, but they do, and I can't tell them not to. I can only try to help them be more safe.
Right.
So,
David Concannon, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me. It's been really quite interesting to explore all of this with you, and I hope we'll have a chance to talk again soon.
I know we will. And Wayne, that's why I wanted to talk to you before I spoke to anybody else about this. I knew that you would understand, or at least you would, what's the saying? Journalism without research is just commentary. And I knew you would do your homework, and I knew that we would have an intellectual conversation today. I'm really glad we did.
Thank you so much, Dave.
All right. Have a good one.
Talk to you soon. My thanks to David Concannon for taking the time today to speak with me about the OceanGate Titan disaster, and to look forward to the continuing need for us to explore this amazing world in which we live and this amazing universe. There's a story told of a day when President John F. Kennedy visited Cape Canaveral to see the progress of the space program. The program that he had inspired in an address to the nation. JFK met a janitor that day who happened to be sweeping the floor, and he asked the janitor about his job. And the janitor's response was, "I'm helping to put a man on the moon, Mr. President." President Kennedy loved to tell that story because it represented the unifying power of the American spirit and the essential and the human spirit and the essential value of community in our efforts to move the country and the world forward. The life and times of David Concannon reflects that same spirit, weaving together the strands of adventure, exploration, and community like sweetgrass into an ethos that reflects a reverence for the earth, for the sea, for the universe, and for the rule of law and democratic principles. After all, besides being an acclaimed explorer, he is also a trial lawyer with an enviable record of achievement, including a win before the United States Supreme Court. Among David's remarkable achievements are multiple trips in the Titanic, going into the Marianas Trench in a Russian submersible. But I'd be willing to bet, were you to talk about the adventure he counts as his crowning achievement, it would be the one on which he embarked when he married his wife, acclaimed author Kim Franks, who is not only a documentarian of many of his adventures, but an obvious and continuing inspiration to him. And I say that because even though he has the soul of an explorer, he is a genuine and decent human being. I thank him for taking the time to speak with us, despite the sadness that he has to be feeling as a result of this accident. Thanks for joining us on the Radical Centrist podcast. The show notes for this podcast can be found at theradicalcentrist.us, where you can make a contribution, or you can also take a trip over to the gallery site and purchase a piece of original art that helps to defray the costs of doing this podcast without advertising. Now, we may find that we have to do advertising at some point, but so far we've managed to do it simply based on the sales of art. And I appreciate that because I hate doing advertising. Thanks also, of course, to our good friend Free Joseph, reggae musician extraordinaire, who has, through the goodness of his heart, donated to us the use of his song, Tell Me Why, for the Radical Centrist podcast. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on the next edition of the Radical Centrist podcast. And now, take us out, Free.
dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We always feel that there is something sweeter. Ouch! Got to realize that we could do a bit better. Find more solutions and share with each other. They taught me from the Bible. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why.